Hi guys, I'm Kristen. This is Kristen is Fully Booked, and today I want to share all of the things that you need to remember before you pick up Nona the Ninth. Now this video is coming out about a week after the release of Nona the Ninth. In an ideal world, yes, I would have had it up before, and that originally was the plan, but just life happened and that isn't what happened. But maybe you haven't yet had an opportunity to pick up Nona the Ninth and you want a little bit of a refresher of what happened in Gideon and Harrow the Ninth, the first two books in this series, because there's so much that happened. And maybe you didn't have a chance to reread those books before you pick up Nona the Ninth, and you just want a little bit of a refresher before you do so. So I'm going to go through like a brief summary of the first book, what kind of important things that we learned from that, as well as what specifically happened in Harrow the Ninth, and to remind you of all of the important reveals that happened towards the end of the book, as well as like a character status, who's alive, who's dead, who's MIA, that sort of a thing. So this goes without saying, of course, that then all of this is spoilers for both Gideon and Harrow the Ninth. If you have not read those books, you don't want to know what happens in those books, stop watching this video. I'll start off with just a brief synopsis of what happened in the first book, Gideon the Ninth. This is going to be a very, very brief summary, and we'll talk about like all of the implications and what we actually know about things after that. But to start off in Gideon, we arrive at the ninth house or the ninth planet, where the heir to this house, Harrow, convinces Gideon, who is an orphan from this house, to act as her cavalier in an upcoming attempt to become one of the lictors in this world, which is sort of like a hand to the god. Think like an undying saint with immense necromantic magical abilities. Harrow is replacing her actual cavalier, Ortis, who then flees with his mother on a spaceship that is then blown up by someone else. I think his name was called Crooks, because he's like super loyal to the house. Now, when Gideon and Harrow arrived at the first planet, or like the first house, it takes place in a place called Canaan House, and they, along with the other heir and cavalier representatives from all of the other 7 houses, so not first house, essentially learn that they are going to be given various clues that direct them into specific challenges, that teaches them certain things that they need to know in order to become a lictor. But people start getting murdered along the way. With all of that going on, they eventually discover that to become a lictor, the necromancer essentially has to kill and then like consume the soul of their cavalier, and that the like ongoing dying state of the cavalier's soul within them is what provides the necromantic power that the lictors have. One of the original lictors, so Cytherea the First, has actually snuck into this, I'm going to say competition again, we all know that's not the case, in place of one of the other heirs, and has been the one who has been killing off all of the other heirs and cavaliers along the way. She's doing this for a couple different reasons. One, we know that she does not want there to become any new lictors. And then the other reason is that she implies that she is actually trying to lure God to the first house for a specific reason. In the final showdown scene, Gideon ultimately sacrifices herself by killing herself, throwing herself onto this like metal fence, great thing, forcing Harrow to become a lictor, which she does, sort of. But in this showdown, then Harrow has the powers of a lictor, as well as Ianthe, one of the other heirs who became a lictor, and the two of them team up against Cytherea to defeat her. She and Ianthe, the only other successful heir to become a lictor, are picked up on God's spaceship, and he makes a bargain with them, or essentially asks them to join him in this ongoing battle against evil to save the Empire, and they both agree. And that is where we end off with Gideon the Ninth. Now, before we go on to the events of Harrow the Ninth, I wanted to go through like just a few like facts that we know about the ninth house specifically. Now, the ninth house is a priesthood of sorts whose ultimate goal is just to make sure that the locked tomb stays forever closed and locked. And in the locked tomb, there is the body of, I think what was originally described as like the ultimate enemy of this empire. And I'm going to throw in some mixture of facts that we learned both in the first and second book here in this like fact section. So we do also know that this house was originally created by Anastasia, who was a failed lictor, and she was given the task by God to close up this body behind the locked tomb, but she was supposed to seal herself along with everyone else on the other side of it, and she does not do that, and instead creates the ninth house. The locked tomb is set up with wards that are essentially supposed to kill anyone who tries to cross it. Harrow, at the ripe old age of 10, in an attempt to try to kill herself on a particularly difficult day, tries to break into the locked tomb, but she actually succeeds and does not die. And it's here that she sees the body laying in state, or like chained up in this coffin. Gideon witnessed this event, and because she and Harrow have a tumultuous, complicated dynamic and relationship, she rats out Harrow to her parents. Harrow's parents then kill themselves. They also force their cavalier to kill himself, and they even attempt to make Harrow attempt to kill herself as well, but she does not follow through with it. And she has been, since that event at the age of 10, kind of like puppeteering her parents, pretending that they are still alive this entire time. We also know that Harrow was born in this mass genocide or mass killing of all of the children, I think up to the age of 17 or 18, all at once, in an attempt to convert that like dying energy that fuels necromancy, it's like thanergy or thalergy, one of the two, into ensuring that Harrow's mother not only gets pregnant with Harrow, but that Harrow is in fact a necromancer, making her an extremely powerful necromancer because she was like originally fueled by the deaths of all of those children. Gideon, for some reason, who was like a 1-year-old baby at the time, did not die in this mass killing, but they don't know why. Final thing to know or to remember about this situation is that Gideon was orphaned on the Ninth house when her mother sort of like floated in from outer space in like either a spacesuit or like a small little ship, I don't remember, and the mom died giving birth to Gideon, screaming out the name Gideon. Now we're going to go into a section that I am going to refer to as just what even happened in Harrow the Ninth. I think everyone knows that this book was really, really weird and different. About 70% of the book was written in second-person perspective, and the other 30-ish% of the book was a retelling of the events from the first book, but with some very drastic changes going on. At the beginning of Harrow the Ninth, we pick back up with Harrow, who is still on the ship with God, whose name is John of all things, and she appears to have some pretty significant changes to her mental faculties, as well as the understanding that something didn't go completely right with her lictorship. So she, even though she has some of the lictorhood powers, she's not like a true full lictor yet because something went wrong. Ianthe gives her a packet of letters, each addressed to a specific person or to be read in the event of a specific thing. And these letters are actually written by Harrow herself, who explained that she has completed the work in order to like protect Harrow sort of, but also as like one of her only true choices in life. She chose to do this work and she has to follow along with whatever the letters say and to trust, you know, her past self for doing that, as well as that she owes Ianthe a huge favor. When we are with Harrow in present time, like on the ship and moving forward, everything is written in second-person perspective. It also becomes clear that Harrow does not know who Gideon is and starts referring to her past cavalier as having been Ortis. Now, most of the book takes place on the planet, I believe, or on the ship called the Mithraeum, and this is where God and the other lictors like have their like main hangout, main group session, and we meet the other remaining lictors, Mercymorn, Augustine, and Ortis the First. Sorry if you can hear my neighbors outside. They're playing like right beneath my window and I just feel like a horrible person asking them to move, so I'm not going to. We learned during this that in the creation of like lictorhood during the resurrection of the various planets that God has resurrected and all of the people therein, he created something, or they accidentally created these resurrection beasts, which I believe are like the revenants of the planets that died, and these resurrection beasts have been chasing them for the past 10,000 years ever since. They've managed to kill some, but not all of them, and one of them is on their way to the Mithraeum to, you know, kill them and whatever. The other sections of the book are written in first person, and this is the retelling of the events of the first book with a significant change, and that is that we begin those sections with Harrow and Ortis still on the Ninth house, where Harrow is actually asking Ortis to come with her to become like, to try to attain lictorshiphood, and she confesses a significant detail to him, which is that she is insane, and she wants him to help her cover up that from all of the other heirs and cavaliers when they go. It turns out that Harrow experiences both auditory and visual hallucinations. And we see these hallucinations through the other section of the book, where Harrow is actually still visited by the body, which is the figure who she saw in the locked tomb. She both sees and thinks that she like speaks to and hears things from the body, and has for a significant portion of her life ever since she went into the locked tomb. What's interesting about this retelling of the first book is that the events are extremely different. Harrow tends to only interact with people who she didn't really interact with, actually. In the first book, Gideon the Ninth, specifically, she is interacting only with the people who actually died and who were murdered at Canaan House. And in this retelling of the events, the people that are being murdered are the ones who were not murdered in that first retelling of that through Gideon the Ninth. Final note here is that Harrow is actually very clearly obsessed and in love with the figure that she refers to as the body. That is like a really, really brief sort of overview of like what Harrow the Ninth is like. And I think the more important thing to take away from Harrow the Ninth is actually all of the reveals that we get. And I will go into like specific character interactions when I talk about character status. Now for the section I'm going to refer to as what have we learned by the end of Harrow the Ninth? There are so many crazy reveals in the final section of Harrow the Ninth. A lot of the book is really confusing. You don't really understand all of the world building that is happening, all of the events that are going on. You don't understand. But then suddenly in the last, I don't know, like 10% of the book, the last few chapters, so many reveals are coming at you that make everything else that happened in the book click and make sense. The least dramatic thing I think here is that this alternate retelling of the events from Gideon the Ninth is actually a sort of dreamlike state or a retelling that exists within this bubble of space within the river, which is this metaphysical place to represent like a spirit world sort of. But Harrow has been recreating these events in her mind in order to fill in the blanks of some of the things that she did as part of the work that her letters refer to. It turns out that Harrow actually rearranged her brain folds to forget the existence of our very own Gideon the Ninth. Now we're going to get into some complicated Gideon Ordis stuff coming up, so I'm always going to say like our Gideon or Gideon the Ninth to refer to that like amazing, badass, red-headed, lesbian cavalier that we met in the first book, and I will try to make other distinguishers for other things. So Harrow has wiped out her ability to recall the existence of Gideon, and this retelling of the events where she takes Ortis as her cavalier is an attempt to fill in the gaps of where Gideon would have been. Now Harrow did this because if she cannot remember the existence of Gideon, she cannot fully consume Gideon's soul. And that is why her lictorship didn't like fully take place or like kick in or didn't complete, because she didn't fully consume Gideon's soul because she couldn't remember who Gideon was. And on top of that, it is actually Gideon who has been narrating all of those second person perspective bits throughout the rest of the book, and hence why it is you this, you that in reference to Harrow. It has been Gideon narrating the events to us, the reader, the whole time. Now, still in this alternate version of like events, this retelling, this play essentially that Harrow is created in the bubble in the river, we discover that Harrow has been haunted by the soul or the revenant, actually like a kind of angry ghost, is what I'm interpreting revenant as, of somebody called Commander Wake, who was the dead leader of the rebellion called Blood of Eden, and is Gideon, our Gideon's biological mother. Now, while Harrow's soul is in this like bubble within the river figuring all of this out, this is when the big showdown is happening in the Mithraeum, and during this time period, Gideon, our Gideon's soul, has actually sort of taken possession of Harrow's physical body, because Harrow's soul is like stuck in the river going through all of those reveals and this like battle with the Revenant Commander Wake. So now back in the current timeline, we are having a bunch of reveals. From here, I'm just going to list out all of the reveals and not necessarily go through like the order of the progression of the events. Like, I'm not going to retell you how everything happened. I'm just going to like state the reveals and the things that we learned in this final showdown while Gideon is possessing Harrow's body. Augustine and Mercy Morn, two of the three remaining lictors, had conspired with Commander Wake, the leader of the rebellion, about 20-ish years ago to determine if the body of Electo, or AL, is actually dead or was actually dead and locked in the tomb on the Ninth House. And that is why Gideon's mom, Commander Wake, was on the Ninth House when she died. They, I'm going to say extracted, and I will leave you to fill in the memory of exactly how that came to be, but they extracted some semen from God, and Commander Wake actually used that semen to impregnate herself with God's baby, who at this point we all know is Gideon the Ninth. And they did this because one of the wards, or like the biggest, strongest ward to keep the locked tomb closed, was a blood ward for God. So only God or anything apparently containing his DNA could cross that barrier, that ward, and still live. From this, I surmise that the only reason Harrow actually survived when she was 10 and tried to break and broke into the locked tomb was because she had been in a physical confrontation with Gideon earlier that day, and I suspect was covered in some of Gideon's blood, which allowed her to enter the locked tomb. Through all of this discovery and the physical color of God's eyes, Alecto's eyes, and our Gideon the Ninth's eyes, they discover, and they as in like Augustine and Mercy Morn, who are relating all of this, they realize that Alecto was actually God's cavalier, meaning that he had found a way to attain lictorship and to get all of those powers without killing their cavaliers, like all of the other lictors did. And he had that information before they all killed their cavaliers, which means that he actually withheld that information from them. When Mercy Morn learns this, she kills John, but it turns out John is unkillable, and he sort of like recreates himself. However, I think it is important to note that during this time, it is likely that their son, Dominicus, which is held together, or like is being powered or fueled by God's power, probably also died during the brief window of time that God was dead. We haven't had any impact from that. They briefly mentioned that it might have affected the planets. I just think that that's important to remember going into Nona, because I imagine we're going to be dealing with some repercussions of that temporary death of their son. It is here now where I have to insert a quick little thing that I think I forgot to mention earlier. When Harrow replaced the existence of Gideon in her memory with her Ortis, with her Cavalier Ortis from the Ninth House, she accidentally just switched those two words. So the third lictor, like Ortis the First, that she's been referring to as Ortis this whole time, it turns out his name is actually Gideon. So it's actually Gideon the First, not Ortis the First. And so now we're going to get into some complicated Gideon versus Gideon stuff. Now, when God recreates himself, he immediately kills Mercy Morn and then demands an oath of loyalty from the remaining people in the room, including Augustine the First, Ianthe the First, Gideon the First, the lictor, and he excludes our Gideon currently occupying Harrow's body. Ianthe and Gideon immediately do so. However, Augustine refuses and immediately takes them all, including their physical location, and throws them into the river, which is again this like metaphysical spirit world. And he begins battling God and trying to suck him into what was kind of described as like the bottom of this river, this gaping hole that was also at an earlier time referred to as hell. And the belief that I think that it's the only way to truly kill God, because no one can come back after they have gone through that abyss, which the specific name I'm forgetting, Stratus or something like that. It had a sort of atmospheric term. Our Gideon, again currently occupying Harrow's body, is saved by Gideon the First, whose soul, it turns out, is actually dead. His soul died while fighting or battling that resurrection beast, which we've kind of all forgotten about, and apparently it, turned away and ran away. His soul, Gideon the First's soul, died while battling the resurrection beast, and his cavalier's soul, named Pyrrha, took over in place. Apparently, Gideon the First and Pyrrha's lictorship wasn't complete either, and Pyrrha's soul wasn't completely destroyed and has sort of occasionally been occupying Gideon the First's physical body sometimes. So it is actually the Cavalier Pyrrha occupying Gideon the First's body who saves our Gideon occupying Harrow's body. Gentle plug here, if you like all this soul switching, complicated who are they, physical body, soul kind of stuff, I'm going to do a gentle plug for you to check out Course of Dragons series by Jen Lyons. Meanwhile, during all of this, showdown with God and the lictors and all of that, Harrow's soul is still in the river, and specifically into that bubble that she created where she was reenacting the play of the events of the first book. All of the other heirs and cavaliers that she's been interacting with are actually the ghosts of the people who died in the first book, and that was why it was all the people that had died. I want to finish this section with the state of things of where we leave off at the end of Harrow the Ninth, like our final scenes. Gideon, as I said, our Gideon, occupying Harrow's physical body, has been saved and taken out of the river by Pyrrha the First, or Pyrrha the Cavalier, occupying Gideon the First's physical body, and they go somewhere. Harrow's soul is still in the bubble within the river, where she is told by the ghost of Dulcinea, the seventh, or like Dulcinea from the seventh house, that someone is controlling her physical body in the world. Harrow decides in the moment to leave the bubble, and from there we get this, like, you know, sense of whatever, like she's lifting up through water and there's revenants everywhere, and she winds up in the locked tomb on the ninth house, or in her belief that's where she is, and she finds the empty tomb with the two-handed sword inside. She chooses to crawl inside of this coffin, this tomb, or whatever. She crawls inside, cuddles up with the two-handed sword, and sees one of our Gideon's dirty magazines. And that is where we leave off with Harrow's soul. Then we have an epilogue that is said to take place 6 months after the final showdown, and an unnamed, unknown person is describing their day-to-day, their life to you. It is clear that this is taking place in a world that sounds a lot more modern than what we have seen to date so far, and a lot more like every day. They describe that they are living with 3 people: the person who goes to work for them, the person that takes care of them, and the person that teaches them. It finishes off with this person who we're seeing this moment from asking the person who cares for them, do you know who I am yet? And no, we don't yet, replies Camilla. So leaving you with that final note here, I'm going to jump into the final section of this video, and that is our character status by the end of book 2. Who's alive? Who's dead? Where is everyone? So from the second house, we had Judith Deuterus, who is alive. This was the necromancer from the second house. They, we know, are alive, and they are currently injured and being held against their will by Blood of Eden. Her Cavalier Marta Days, however, did die and was a ghost in Harrow's reenactment of Canaan House. From the third house, we had Coronabeth Tridentarius, who is alive. We know that they are not a necromancer. This is Ianthe's twin, and we know that she is actually currently with Blood of Eden and has kind of taken up their cause. Ianthe, of course, also from third house, is now Ianthe the First and is a lictor, and at the very end of the final showdown with Augustine and God in the river, Ianthe actually saves God. So we assume that Ianthe is somewhere with God. And then, of course, their Cavalier, Niberius, he is dead and fueling Ianthe's lictor powers. From the fourth house, we had Isaac and Jean-Marie, and to our knowledge, both are dead, and we didn't even really get to see them as ghosts. Then we have from the fifth house, Abigail Pent and Magnus Quinn. Both are dead, and both were ghosts that were in Harrow's little show of Canaan House in the river. From the sixth house, Palamedes, Sextus, and Camilla. Now, Palamedes was the necromancer who kind of befriended Harrow in the first book. Palamedes died. He kind of blew himself up at the end of Gideon the Ninth, but in the book Harrow the Ninth, we discover that he is sort of a ghost or a revenant that has attached himself to some of his physical bones. Camilla, his Cavalier, was saved and is also, along with Coronabeth and Judith Deuterus from the second and third houses, not respectively, I did that backwards. Camilla is also with Blood of Eden, and she is in possession of the bones that Palamedes is sort of like tied to. Then we have seventh house representatives. That was Dulcinea Septimus and Protesilaus, I think his name was, and both are dead. Both were ghosts that took place as part of Harrow's little show in Canaan House in the river. And then, of course, we had the eighth house representatives, Silas and his uncle Colum. They both died in the final showdown at the end of Gideon the Ninth. On top of this, we also have Ortis Niganad. This is Ortis from the ninth house, who was originally Harrow's Cavalier, and it was his ghost that she was using as her pretend Cavalier in that little show in Canaan House, but he is still a ghost and still understandably dead. We know that Mercymorn is dead, or at least she was killed by God, assuming that that is a permanent status on her part. Ianthe, again, I said Ianthe the First went off somewhere with God and John out of the river, one could imagine. I believe Augustine got sucked into the pit, into the hell at the bottom of the river. And Gideon, now we're into the complicated final status, people. Gideon the First, his physical body is still alive, but Gideon the First's soul has died, and Pyrrha, his cavalier, is physically occupying and controlling his body. Pyrrha/Gideon rescued and took our Gideon in Harrow's physical body somewhere. And Harrow's soul, we would imagine it's just her soul or her spirit, is possibly in the locked tomb, or at least she believes she is. And that is what we know going into the book Nona the Ninth. Did you follow all of that? Let me know down below if there are things that you caught in the first or second books that you think that I missed, that you think might be important. I, of course, haven't read Nona the Ninth yet, so I don't know what's important to remember before going into it, but this was my guess of what I think you should try to know and remember before going into reading that book. Are you going to be reading Nona the Ninth? And are you going to be reading it as soon as possible? I have a couple books I have to finish really quick, and then I'm going to be jumping on to that as soon as I can. That is it for me today, guys. I will see you next time. Have a great day. Bye.